I've been reading the Bible all my life. And it wasn't till I retired and started lecturing very late in life that I began to find out how badly I had misunderstood the Bible and other people were misunderstanding it, because although the Bible is very widely spread and very widely, well, they say it's a bestseller all over the world, it's very narrowly understood.
Many people regard the Bible as an icon. The thing itself is sort of stuck on the shelf in its leather binding with its gold trim, and it's a revered and rather feared and not at all well understood or examined thing. And this is what I think I have learned through Dad, is that you have to open that thing and look at it afresh.
You sure do. There's no question about it. You open the beginning of the Bible and you find two names of God, but you don't notice it, especially if you're reading the King James Version. Then you find in the New Testament 4 different accounts of the trial and execution of Jesus. And they're all different. How come? The trouble is, if you treat the Bible as an icon, you're not going to ask, how come?
And of course, what's interesting from my point of view is that my father comes at this largely as a lay biblical scholar, a retired Anglican minister. I come at it as somebody who has degrees in English literature, and I have studied literature and seen how all literature has roots in other literature. And that is true of the Bible as well, that nothing comes from nothing. And to know that is somehow deeply refreshing and very, very enriching in the understanding of any text. Well, there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament, as everyone knows: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The order in which those Gospels were written is really quite important to an understanding of how stories grow in the New Testament, because of course the Gospel writers used each other in how their stories of Jesus grew and developed. So it does matter trying to understand who came first. And the way we dated it and the way we have understood it is that Mark comes first.
Yes, and it goes from Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John.
There are some scholars now who would put Matthew first, but that's very much a minority viewpoint. And it makes more sense, certainly to my way of thinking, to think of Mark as first.
Yeah.
Now that's partly, you could argue, because Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. Yeah. He is a very curt, abbreviated voice. I remember one scholar I talked to describing his trial scene of the trial of Jesus as being a brutal business, because it's so clipped and short and there's no elaboration. You get to Matthew and you have a more elaborate text, still not a very poetic voice perhaps, but a business-like storyteller. When you get to Luke, you're in a different personality altogether. Luke, I always recall one scholar I interviewed who always prefaced any comment he made about Luke with the phrase, "Dear sweet Luke." And he was a scholar from Oxford with this wonderful sonorous accent. And "Dear sweet Luke," because Luke tells the kindest of stories. And then John, John's a different kettle of fish altogether, yet again, and much later than the others.
one thing to bear in mind that is very helpful in understanding how New Testament uses Hebrew Scripture is that you're talking here about an oral tradition, largely. That is, there were people who were literate, obviously, and could write, but most people couldn't, and they would have heard the Hebrew Scriptures read aloud in synagogue. So they would have been as familiar, say, with the Psalms as we are with the songs of our childhood, because these would have been the lyrics that informed their lives, their mythologies, their stories. And so when the Psalms are widely quoted, as they are in the Hebrew Scriptures, or widely alluded to, or reflected even in tangential ways, people would have been picking up these connections and thinking, yes, this connects to what we are familiar with. And by doing so, it has more authority. So when, for instance, Jesus rides in triumph into Jerusalem on a donkey, there are echoes of other triumphal entries to other cities at other times by other great people. This is to be expected. When you see the mention, for instance, of stars, which is the most wonderful metaphor and image in Matthew's Gospel about the birth of Jesus, the star that appeared. Well, stars appear in the Old Testament as well. When you have Joseph dreaming and being instructed by God in a dream to take the baby Jesus into Egypt, there are echoes here of another Joseph who dreamed and was instructed to go, in fact, into Egypt. And so, although you can argue forever about the dating of the Gospels, the identity, for instance, of the Gospel writers, what you cannot argue about is that the Hebrew Scriptures were used, and used extensively, in the writing of the New Testament. The sheer number of echoes and reflections and quotations and allusions to the Hebrew Scriptures that exist in the New Testament are not easily explained away. They're not easily dismissed. Once you start looking for them, they dominate your reading of the New Testament in a very helpful and constructive way, because you see how the stories are built. To dismiss them as a kind of series of remarkable coincidences of language and event that exist between the Old Testament and the New, between the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures, is not doing it justice, because it's too unlikely to be that way. I mean, for instance, if you have take the Song of Mary, her Magnificat that she sings when she finds out she is so miraculously pregnant. That song is almost word for word the same as the song that Hannah sung centuries and centuries earlier when she found she was unexpectedly and wonderfully pregnant. To see it as oh gosh, it's really funny that Mary happened to sing the same song as Hannah, it's too flat. It's not helpful enough. It's not refreshing. The way that looking at it as a series of building blocks to create something new and wonderful can be helpful. I mean, here we are on the shore, and I mean, look at those waves. They come in. There's a new wave on the shore every moment, but there's something pushing them, and it's all those former movements, waves, motions, bits of wind, tidal action. They all contribute to what is landing here and now. And to see it just as a wave that exists entirely of its own is kind of limiting, and I feel very much the same about New Testament stories. When you begin to find what lies behind them, it's much grander.
The question of the virginity of Mary has to involve what must be one of the most famous mistranslations probably in the history of any text anywhere in the world. And it's profoundly complicated, of course, how it arose. But there you had Matthew, who quotes Isaiah 7:14, which says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bring forth a child, and his name shall be called Immanuel." And then you think, oh yeah, right, well, he's quoting Isaiah. And then if you look in Isaiah, in a good English translation now, you'll read, it doesn't say that at all. The King James Version does say virgin, I might add, but that's different. The King James Version, bless its heart, is not the best translation in the world. It is full of mistakes, although it's full of wonderful poetry. But in a good modern translation, the word virgin does not appear in Isaiah. The word young woman appears.
It does.
And that all goes back, wasn't it 250 years before the birth of Jesus, Dad? How did that...
Well, that was the translation of the Hebrew into Greek, which was done in Alexandria under one of the Ptolemies. And and with the patronage of the Ptolemy. And it was done by Greek Jews who'd been speaking Greek for centuries. And they were more Greek than they were Jews.
And yet they translated from the Hebrew into Greek. 250 before the birth of Jesus, they translated what was the young woman word in Hebrew into virgin.
Yeah.
And that translation, the Septuagint, was what Matthew was using when he was quoting Isaiah. It's complicated. Now, did he know he was quoting a mistranslation? Did he choose to quote a mistranslation? Did it suit him? There's a lot of other material.
Or did the Greek Jews in Alexandria 200 years earlier than Matthew know that they were mistranslating? Or did they deliberately mistranslate? You don't know.
I think what you can be sure of, though, is that that particular mistranslation has caused more grief in the Christian centuries than almost anything else, because the debates about the virginity of Mary, of course, are profound and terrible. But the idea of virginal or miraculous conception was so much in the air, in the ether of the ancient world. The Virgin Diana was greatly revered amongst the Greek gods, for instance. There is a passage in Virgil that says, "A virgin shall come forth, and this blessed child shall pour forth wondrous things upon the world, and a new age will dawn." And then as for just plain old miraculous conceptions, not virginal, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, are full of them. I mean, there are time and time and time again in the most moving passages.
Samson and Samuel.
Yes, Samson and Samuel. Isaac, Sarah, mother of Isaac, was too old to conceive. It's usually women who were barren who could not conceive. And then by some wondrous intervention of the deity, they were able to conceive. But again, back to the sort of ether, the atmosphere in the ancient world, you'll find that great men in the secular world, quite apart from the biblical texts, quite often their births were heralded by something extraordinary. My favorite one is Alexander the Great. Plutarch writes of Alexander the Great's mother's womb being struck by lightning before she and her husband, Philip of Macedon, had even had any sexual contact. So therefore, when Alexander was born, was he possibly the progeny of the god of the thunderbolt? Yeah. And then as for that god of the thunderbolt and miraculous births, well, Zeus, as you know, he was always zapping some poor unfortunate female and making her pregnant by some extraordinary means, like a shower of gold, or the bull, or Leda and the swan. And so the idea of a strange godly intervention having a part in a great birth is common and grand and wonderful. And how could it be otherwise? It's always amazed me, before I really started to look into it, that Matthew's Gospel opens with such a boring chapter. The role of the genealogy is simply to establish Jesus as one of the great and the good, of the great and good lineage of the rulers of Israel. He has to be seen to be of the line of David, and traced all the way back to Abraham. You don't get bigger names than that in the history of Israel. So for Jesus to be recognized as a leader, as the Messiah, this was necessary for Matthew to do, and he did it with flair. He opens his gospel with it. Interestingly, from my point of view, and from many other people's points of view, is that this list uncharacteristically includes a number of women, because usually the list of begets, which are very boring and long and unpronounceable, usually just have men in them. But this one has 4 women, and they are 4 women whose reputation is just a little bit questionable. There was Tamar, who slept with her father-in-law and had twins. There was Rahab, who was a prostitute who helped save the Israelites. There was Bathsheba, although she isn't named directly, she is in there. Her story was a national scandal, really, her liaison with the great King David. And the 4th was Ruth, who more or less offered herself to Boaz at a cornfield, and then she went on to become the great-grandmother of the great King David. So they're a mixed bunch, really, and Mary is in good company there, because she herself has been subjected to a lot of conjecture about her own virtue. The stories of the birth of Jesus are only told in 2 of the Gospels, and this again is something that cannot be stressed enough. It's only Matthew and Luke who tell these stories, and they tell pretty different versions of it.
For instance, the fact that we all assume Jesus was born in a stable. It's there on all our Christmas cards, but it's only because Luke, and only Luke, says that there was a manger in which the baby was laid. He doesn't say stable. He doesn't talk about an ox and an ass. Those are all just thrown in later generations by Christmas card makers, painters, Renaissance artists, wonderful imaginary poets. I mean, it's all a wonderful creation, but this is a mythology that has grown and grown and grown.
The Magi, for instance, the famous "We Three Kings of Orient are," only appear in Matthew's Gospel. They don't appear anywhere else.
And who said 3 kings? There are 3 gifts. And the 3 gifts come straight out of Song of Songs, if I remember rightly.
Who said kings? Who said kings? I mean, it doesn't say any of that, does it? And
no.
In fact, in some of the stuff that Dad pointed me towards, some of the medieval literature, you can find as much as 12 magi coming back and forth. And as for the kings, well, that takes us into the territory that Dad first brought me in, that these 3 magi, these 3 kings, come out of the Old Testament.
They come right out of the Hebrew Scriptures.
And I get a great kick out also looking at the later elaborations on the story of the 3 kings. I mean, if you look at adoration of the Magi, pictures on the walls of every great gallery, there's these kings are given names. Sometimes there's a tradition that one of them is black, which is a fine enough tradition, but it's certainly not biblical. It was somehow to prove that these were Gentiles coming from afar, that the greatness that was Christ was reaching out to other nations.
Well, that question annoys me because if you get any modern, even relatively modern translation of the Bible, you'll find that Mark's Gospel does stop at the 8th verse of the 16th chapter, and all the rest is later additions.
And this is a widely accepted theory, isn't it?
Oh, it's well, you can see it. You don't even have to need a clue.
You don't have to be a scholar.
You don't have to be a scholar. It shows through the translations. The style changes. The whole thing goes into something else.
Yeah, it goes into a very flat kind of uninteresting narrative that's just boom, 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 boom. He's running through a few resurrection appearances, and then that's the end of the story.
The trouble was that the other Gospel writers, half a generation or a generation after the time of Mark, had to give in, I suppose, to their Christian followers who wanted to know what was this that Mark says. They found the tomb empty and ran away. What happened? And so these stories start to appear.
As the Gospels get further and further from the time of the death of Jesus, the resurrection appearances increase in number. So you have more in John than you do in Matthew, for instance. And I think that's very telling. But having said that, now I look at the resurrection appearance stories, and what I can say is that they are part of a tradition in which an appearing one comes to either a disbeliever or a crowd of people who are in trouble of some sort, and the appearing one in some fashion resolves the problem. A particularly telling appearance story in the Old Testament, which is actually in one of the books of the Apocrypha, the book of Tobit, has the angel Raphael appearing to Tobit, who is walking along the road, and Tobit doesn't realize what's happening. It doesn't know who this is. This angel helps him through a lot of difficulties and finally reveals himself and then disappears. On the road to Emmaus in the book of Luke, Jesus appears to his followers and walks along with them, helps them resolve difficulties they're having in their minds, then reveals himself to them and goes from their presence. These are indirect connections. They're not like, say, the three wise men who are so directly out of the Old Testament, or the Song of Mary, which is so directly out of the Old Testament. But they are indirect allusions, and they add to the power of the story because they are using techniques of the storytelling tradition. And the stories of the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection appearances, draw on these. There is no doubt in my mind that they do. What a lot of this kind of thinking leads to is people turning to me or my father or people like us who examine the Bible as closely as we can in fashions that we feel are appropriate and saying, yes, but what are you really doing? Because what really happened? What really happened with Jesus' life and death and birth and so on? And it's a question that we find hard to deal with because we certainly don't know what really happened, and we don't think the stories tell us what really happened. They are telling us committed forms of stories, putting forward a point of view, but they are not designed in any form as historical reporting. And so we are left uncertain, and this can be very hard to live with, or it can be a very liberating thing, because certainty...
Well, it's terrible when people expect you to be certain when you're not certain. And it's missing the point, because if the thing ends in a mystery, let it end in a mystery. That's why I'm so fond of Mark's Gospel's ending.
Which ends with the women running away in fear.
They're afraid, and they run away from a mystery. Well, why wouldn't they? It's a much more sensible thing than to be certain of yourself in a situation where you can't possibly have any certainty anyway. And the horror that arises out of religious certainty is unspeakable, and it's awful.
So I remember a phrase that Dad once used to me when I was a lot younger, that terror is the product of certainty. And it's sort of haunted me. I have to say it's haunted me for years and years and years, because I do believe that to be true. And the more I see of religious certainty, the more I believe that. Yes, trees. I really reckon, there's something in this. And nothing comes from nothing. Here again, I mean, you have to have stuff, dead stuff, old stuff around in order to make it all happen. And I mean, look, like over there, I reckon that, that fern is probably growing out of a great mass of how many dead trees? I don't know. And that's what, at least we have that wonderful metaphor around us. Perhaps we can carry these metaphors too far, though, I don't know. But certainly I love the tree idea. The compost heap theory of how a story grows. I don't know if we'll get away with that one.
Information about companion books for this program is available by writing to the address on your screen.